Welcome to Just Listen Books channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification. Daring Greatly by Brené Brown is a nonfiction book that delves into the importance of vulnerability in creating strong connections, leadership, and living a full life. The book is structured around the idea that vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, but a courageous act that can lead to more meaningful, connected, and empowered lives. Introduction. Brené Brown introduces the concept of vulnerability, which she defines as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She argues that vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. The title Daring Greatly is inspired by Theodore Roosevelt's speech about the courage it takes to be vulnerable and step into the arena of life. Chapter 1. Scarcity. Looking inside our culture of never enough. In this chapter, the author dives deep into the concept of scarcity, a pervasive sense of never having enough, never being enough, or not doing enough. This chapter is crucial as it lays the foundation for understanding how scarcity impacts our lives and relationships, setting the stage for the transformative power of vulnerability that Brown explores throughout the book. The roots of scarcity. Brown begins by examining how scarcity roots in our culture, manifesting in constant comparisons, competitive mindsets, and the hustle for worthiness. This culture of scarcity affects individuals on a deeply personal level, influencing how we see ourselves and our interactions with others. She explains that scarcity thrives in a culture where everyone is hyper-aware of lack, scarcity, and self-worth. A significant focus of this chapter is on how scarcity impacts our feelings of self-worth. Brown discusses how living in a state of perceived lack leads to feelings of shame, fear, and disconnection. The never-enough mindset creates a loop where individuals constantly seek validation and acceptance outside themselves, often feeling unworthy of love and belonging. The myth of scarcity. Brown challenges the myth that scarcity is simply a part of human condition or an inevitable aspect of life. She argues that the culture of scarcity is perpetuated by societal norms and expectations that prioritize achievement, perfection, and material success over genuine connections and emotional well-being. Vulnerability as a solution. The chapter emphasizes that vulnerability is a powerful antidote to scarcity. By embracing our vulnerabilities and imperfections, we can step away from the endless cycle of comparison and competition. Brown suggests that acknowledging and sharing our fears, failures, and uncertainties can lead to greater connection, empathy, and authentic engagement with the world around us. Practical steps. Brown provides practical advice for readers on how to combat scarcity in their own lives. She encourages mindfulness about the triggers and patterns of scarcity thinking, promoting gratitude, self-compassion, and connectedness as key strategies to foster a sense of enoughness. She also highlights the importance of setting boundaries and cultivating a practice of self-care to protect against the damaging effects of scarcity. Chapter 1 of Daring Greatly sets a critical framework for understanding the detrimental effects of living in a culture dominated by scarcity. Brown convincingly argues that embracing vulnerability can lead to a more fulfilling and authentic life, challenging readers to reconsider their own relationships with scarcity, worthiness, and vulnerability. Through this exploration, Brown not only diagnoses a pervasive social issue, but also offers a hopeful path forward for individuals seeking to break free from the constraints of never enough. Chapter 2. Debunking the vulnerability myths. In this chapter, the author tackles head-on the common misconceptions about vulnerability. She identifies and systematically dismantles several myths that prevent people from embracing vulnerability, demonstrating through research, anecdotes, and analysis that vulnerability is not a weakness but a profound source of strength. This chapter is vital for reshaping the reader's understanding of what it means to be vulnerable. Myth 1. Vulnerability is weakness. Brown begins by addressing the most pervasive myth, that vulnerability is synonymous with weakness. She argues that society often misinterprets vulnerability as a form of emotional exposure that should be avoided, especially in a culture that values toughness and self-reliance. However, Brown's research suggests the opposite. Vulnerability requires a tremendous amount of courage. To open oneself up to potential hurt, failure, or criticism is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to one's strength and bravery. Myth 2. Vulnerability is optional. The second myth Brown debunks is the idea that vulnerability is a choice, that individuals can opt out of feeling or showing vulnerability. Brown counters this by highlighting that vulnerability is an inherent part of the human experience. Every interaction and relationship involves some degree of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. Acknowledging and engaging with our vulnerability is not optional if we seek meaningful connections and a full life. Myth 3. We can go it alone. The third myth revolves around the belief in self-sufficiency, that we can go through life without relying on others or showing our vulnerabilities. Brown emphasizes the importance of connection, arguing that humans are wired for connection, and it is only through vulnerability that deep, authentic connections can be formed. She illustrates how the myth of not needing anyone can lead to isolation, disconnection, and, paradoxically, greater vulnerability. Vulnerability as a strength. Having addressed these myths, Brown spends the rest of the chapter elaborating on why vulnerability is a form of strength. She presents evidence from her research showing that vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, creativity, and innovation. It is only by daring to be vulnerable that individuals can truly connect with others, create new things, and live authentically. Strategies to embrace vulnerability. Brown offers strategies for overcoming the fears associated with being vulnerable. She encourages readers to recognize and challenge the myths they've internalized about vulnerability, to practice self-compassion, and to slowly allow themselves to open up in safe and supportive environments. The process of debunking these myths is not just intellectual but deeply practical, as it involves changing how we approach our lives, relationships, and work. Chapter 2 is a cornerstone of Daring Greatly, providing the conceptual tools needed to redefine vulnerability. By debunking the myths that equate vulnerability with weakness, that suggest it's optional, and that promote the idea of going it alone, Brown opens up a new perspective. Vulnerability, as she convincingly argues, is not just a path to deeper connection and a more fulfilling life. It is a testament to our courage and strength. Chapter 3. Understanding and Combating Shame. In this chapter, the author delves into the complex relationship between vulnerability and shame, elucidating how the latter can significantly inhibit our ability to embrace the former. Through her insightful analysis, Brown not only highlights the debilitating effects of shame, but also offers practical advice for confronting and mitigating its impact. This chapter is crucial for readers seeking to understand the barriers to vulnerability and how to overcome them. The nature of shame. Brown begins by defining shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. She distinguishes shame from guilt, explaining that while guilt is the feeling of doing something bad, shame is the feeling of being bad. This distinction is critical, as shame directly attacks our sense of self-worth and can lead to destructive behaviors and a reluctance to engage vulnerably with others. Shame and vulnerability. The chapter emphasizes how shame thrives in environments of secrecy, silence, and judgment, creating a cycle that prevents individuals from being vulnerable. When people fear judgment or ridicule, they are less likely to share their true selves, reinforcing the shame that keeps them isolated. Brown argues that vulnerability is the antidote to shame because it involves exposing our authentic selves, thus counteracting the secrecy that shame needs to survive. Recognizing shame. One of the first steps in combating shame, according to Brown, is to recognize when we are experiencing it. She describes common physical responses to shame, such as feeling small, hiding, or wanting to disappear, and identifies the critical role of self-talk in perpetuating shame. By becoming aware of how we respond to and think about our shame experiences, we can begin to address and disarm them. Developing shame resilience. Brown introduces the concept of shame resilience as the ability to practice authenticity when experiencing shame, to move through the experience without sacrificing our values, and to come out on the other side with more courage, compassion, and connection. She outlines 4 elements of shame resilience. 1. Recognizing shame and understanding its triggers. Becoming aware of our personal vulnerabilities to shame and identifying the specific circumstances or messages that trigger it. 2. Practicing critical awareness. Questioning the messages and expectations that tell us we are not good enough. 3. Reaching out. Sharing our shame experiences with trusted individuals who can offer empathy and support. 4. Speaking shame. Talking about shame openly and directly, using language to dissipate its power. Strategies for combating shame. Brown provides practical strategies for combating shame, including developing empathy for oneself and others, cultivating self-compassion, and establishing connections with empathetic individuals who can provide support and understanding. She emphasizes the importance of recognizing our common humanity in mitigating shame, reminding readers that everyone experiences shame and that we are not alone in our struggles. Chapter 3 of Daring Greatly is a comprehensive exploration of shame and its intricate relationship with vulnerability. By understanding how shame operates and implementing strategies to build shame resilience, Brown argues that individuals can move toward a more authentic and vulnerable way of living. This chapter is an essential guide for anyone looking to break free from the chains of shame and embrace a life of greater courage and connection. Chapter 4. The Vulnerability Armory. In this chapter, the author explores the various mechanisms and behaviors individuals employ to shield themselves from the perceived risks of vulnerability. She metaphorically refers to these protective measures as the vulnerability armory, suggesting that while they are intended to safeguard us from harm, they also impede our ability to fully engage with life, love, and connection. Through an insightful examination of these defense mechanisms, Brown illuminates how they detract from our quality of life and offers guidance on how to dismantle this armory. The concept of the vulnerability armory. Brown introduces the vulnerability armory as the collection of strategies we use to avoid feeling exposed, at risk, or emotionally open. These strategies are developed over time as responses to fear, shame, and the societal pressure to appear strong and unaffected. While they may offer short-term relief from discomfort, Brown argues that they ultimately serve as barriers to authentic connection and living wholeheartedly. Forms of armor. Perfectionism. Brown identifies perfectionism as one of the most common pieces of armor. Contrary to what some might believe, perfectionism is not about striving for excellence, but is driven by the fear of making mistakes and being judged. It leads to self-destructive behaviors and thoughts, as the individual constantly tries to meet unattainable standards. Brown emphasizes that perfectionism hampers achievement and creativity by preventing risk-taking and stifling vulnerability. Numbing. Another form of armor is numbing, the attempt to escape discomfort by dulling emotions. Brown discusses how people often resort to substances like alcohol, food, or drugs, as well as behaviors such as excessive work or mindless consumption of media, to numb their feelings. However, numbing does not selectively affect negative emotions. It also diminishes our capacity to experience joy, gratitude, and happiness, leading to a diminished life experience. Foreboding joy. Foreboding joy, according to Brown, is the fear of allowing oneself to feel joy fully because of a lurking belief that it will be taken away. This armor involves rehearsing tragedy to protect against being blindsided by pain or loss. Brown argues that this mechanism robs us of the ability to experience genuine, unfettered joy. Instead, she advocates for practicing gratitude as a way to embrace joy without reservation. Dismantling the armory. Brown provides strategies for dismantling the vulnerability armory, emphasizing the importance of awareness, self-compassion, and acceptance. She encourages readers to recognize their patterns of self-protection, understand the underlying fears and insecurities, and gradually allow themselves to be seen, warts and all. Embracing vulnerability. Ultimately, Brown champions the idea that true courage and connection emerge not from shielding ourselves from vulnerability, but from engaging with it openly and authentically. By accepting our imperfections and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, we open the door to deeper connections with others, more fulfilling experiences, and a more authentic way of living. Chapter 4 of Daring Greatly is a powerful call to confront and shed the protective mechanisms that hinder our lives. Through a thorough exploration of the vulnerability armory and its consequences, Brown guides readers toward a more vulnerable, authentic, and wholehearted existence. This chapter underscores the transformative power of embracing vulnerability, challenging us to remove our armor and step into the arena of life with openness and courage. Chapter 5. Mind the Gap, Cultivating Change and Closing the Disengagement Divide. In this chapter, the author addresses the crucial issue of the discrepancy between our practiced values, what we actually do, think, and feel, and our aspirational values, what we want to do, think, and feel. This gap often leads to disengagement, dissatisfaction, and a lack of authenticity in both our personal and professional lives. Brown explores how vulnerability can serve as a powerful tool to bridge this gap, fostering a culture of engagement, integrity, and alignment between our actions and our values. The gap between practiced and aspirational values. Brown begins by illustrating how individuals and organizations often articulate values that they aspire to live by. Yet, in reality, there is frequently a significant gap between these stated values and their everyday actions. This gap is not only a source of internal conflict and disengagement, but can also lead to a distrustful and cynical environment. Brown argues that to close this gap, both individuals and organizations must engage in honest self-reflection and embrace vulnerability. The role of vulnerability in closing the gap. Vulnerability plays a crucial role in closing the disengagement divide because it involves the courage to face our shortcomings and the openness to change. Brown emphasizes that acknowledging the gap requires admitting that we are not living up to our own standards, which is a vulnerable act. However, it is precisely this acknowledgement that paves the way for genuine change and alignment between our practiced and aspirational values. Cultivating a culture of engagement. Brown discusses how leaders and organizations can cultivate a culture of engagement by embracing vulnerability themselves and encouraging it in others. This involves creating a safe space for open communication, admitting mistakes, and showing a willingness to change. Leaders who demonstrate vulnerability inspire trust and authenticity, which in turn encourages team members to engage more fully with their work and with each other. Strategies for bridging the gap. To bridge the gap between practiced and aspirational values, Brown suggests several practical strategies. Identifying values. Clearly articulate both personal and organizational values. Understanding what truly matters is the first step toward alignment. Self-assessment. Regularly evaluate how well actions and decisions align with stated values. This requires honesty and vulnerability in acknowledging where gaps exist. Feedback and accountability. Foster an environment where constructive feedback is welcomed and where individuals hold themselves and each other accountable for living in accordance with their values. Commitment to change. Commit to ongoing personal and organizational development. Closing the gap is a continuous process that requires effort, patience, and resilience. Personal and professional implications. Brown explores how closing the gap between aspirational and practiced values not only enhances personal integrity and satisfaction, but also has profound implications for professional life. In organizations where leaders and employees are aligned with their values, there is higher engagement, increased trust, and stronger performance. Chapter 5 of Daring Greatly illuminates the transformative potential of vulnerability in bridging the gap between who we are and who we want to be. By embracing vulnerability, individuals and organizations can cultivate a culture of engagement, integrity, and authenticity. Brown's insights offer a roadmap for living and working in alignment with our deepest values, leading to more fulfilling and meaningful lives and workplaces. Chapter 6. Disruptive Engagement, Daring to Rehumanize Education and Work. In this chapter, the author examines how the ethos of vulnerability can be transformative in the realms of education and the workplace. She advocates for a radical shift toward a more humanized approach where showing vulnerability is regarded as a strength rather than a weakness. This shift, Brown argues, can unlock unprecedented levels of creativity, engagement, and productivity by fostering environments that value authenticity and open communication. Vulnerability in education. Brown critiques the current educational landscape, which often prioritizes standardization, competition, and a fear of failure. These elements create an atmosphere where vulnerability is suppressed and genuine learning is hindered. To counter this, Brown proposes integrating vulnerability into educational practices as a means to enhance learning. By encouraging students to ask questions, express curiosity, and acknowledge what they don't know, educators can foster a more inquisitive and engaging learning environment. Cultivate resilience. Teaching students to embrace their vulnerabilities can help them develop resilience and a growth mindset, critical skills for navigating life's challenges. Promote innovation. By valuing creativity and critical thinking over mere memorization or adherence to rigid standards, students are prepared to innovate and solve complex problems. Rehumanizing the workplace. Brown extends her analysis to the workplace, where traditional norms often equate vulnerability with weakness, thereby stifling innovation and genuine connection. She argues that workplaces that embrace vulnerability as a core value can create a culture of trust, collaboration, and innovation. Such workplaces are characterized by enhanced creativity and risk-taking. When employees feel safe to express their ideas without fear of ridicule or retribution, creativity flourishes, and innovation becomes part of the organizational DNA. Greater employee engagement. A culture that encourages vulnerability fosters deeper employee engagement, as individuals feel valued and understood, leading to higher productivity and job satisfaction. Authentic leadership. Leaders who model vulnerability by acknowledging their mistakes and limitations pave the way for a more authentic and transparent organizational culture. Strategies for integration. To integrate vulnerability into education and work, Brown suggests several strategies. Creating a safe environment. This involves developing spaces where individuals can show up as their authentic selves without fear of judgment. Encouraging open communication. Regular, open communication about failures, successes, and ongoing challenges can normalize vulnerability and build a foundation of trust. Modeling vulnerability. Leaders and educators must lead by example, showing vulnerability themselves to encourage others to do the same. Chapter 6 of Daring Greatly presents a compelling case for the rehumanization of education and work through the embrace of vulnerability. Brené Brown vividly illustrates how moving away from a culture of scarcity and fear towards one that values vulnerability can revolutionize how we learn, teach, and work. By fostering environments that celebrate openness, authenticity, and human connection, Brown envisions a future where the full potential of individuals and organizations can be realized. This chapter not only challenges prevailing norms, but also offers a hopeful and actionable path toward more enriching and productive educational and professional experiences. Chapter 7. Wholehearted Parenting. Daring to be the adults we want our children to be. In this chapter, the author addresses the transformative role of vulnerability in parenting. She posits that by embodying vulnerability, parents can lead by example, teaching their children to accept their imperfections and to recognize their intrinsic worthiness of love and belonging. This chapter is a heartfelt appeal to parents to foster environments of openness, authenticity, and empathy, laying the foundation for their children to grow into wholehearted individuals. The essence of wholehearted parenting. Wholehearted parenting, according to Brown, revolves around the willingness of parents to be vulnerable, both with themselves and with their children. This entails acknowledging one's own flaws, fears, and mistakes openly, without shame. Brown argues that such an approach not only humanizes the parent, making them more relatable and approachable, but also empowers children to accept their own vulnerabilities without fear of judgment. Vulnerability as a teaching tool. Brown explores how parents can use their own experiences of vulnerability as teachable moments. By sharing stories of their failures and fears, and how they navigated through them, parents can teach resilience, courage, and the importance of staying connected to others even when it feels difficult. This transparency helps to dismantle the myth of perfection that many children feel pressured to live up to. Fostering a sense of belonging. One of the key themes of the chapter is the critical role parents play in fostering their children's sense of belonging and self-worth. Brown emphasizes that belonging should not be conditional on meeting certain standards or hiding parts of oneself. Rather, it should be unconditional. Vulnerability, with its emphasis on openness and authenticity, is pivotal in communicating this unconditional acceptance to children. Counteracting the culture of scarcity. Brown discusses the prevailing culture of scarcity, highlighted by feelings of never being enough, which can profoundly affect children's self-esteem and sense of worth. She challenges parents to counteract this culture within their families by emphasizing abundance and sufficiency, particularly in terms of love, attention, and validation. Doing so requires parents to confront their own insecurities and to practice self-compassion, thereby modeling these behaviors for their children. Strategies for wholehearted parenting. Brown offers practical strategies for parents aiming to embrace vulnerability and foster wholeheartedness, including practicing empathy, showing empathy towards oneself and others, and teaching children to do the same, as a way to build connection and understanding. Living your values. Clearly identifying personal and family values, living them out in daily life, and using them as a guide for decision-making. Cultivating gratitude and joy. Encouraging the regular practice of gratitude within the family can help combat the scarcity mindset and foster a sense of contentment and joy. In Wholehearted Parenting, Daring to be the Adults We Want Our Children to Be, Brené Brown offers a compelling vision for a new approach to parenting, one that is rooted in vulnerability, authenticity, and empathy. By daring to show up vulnerably in front of their children, parents can nurture a generation that feels worthy of love and belonging, is resilient in the face of adversity, and is compassionate towards themselves and others. This chapter not only concludes daring greatly, but also encapsulates its central message, that vulnerability is not just a path to personal growth and connection, but is also a powerful way to shape a more compassionate and wholehearted society, starting within our own families. Throughout the book, Brown uses a mix of research, personal anecdotes, and practical advice to illustrate how daring greatly through vulnerability can transform the way we live, love, parent, and lead. She encourages readers to embrace vulnerability as a source of strength and a path to a more fulfilling life. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Click subscribe and hit the bell to be the first to enjoy our upcoming audiobooks.